just as the sun has risen, so should your mind and heart. Above all things, have courage, because courage is needed in times such as this. Today is day number 7 on our journey together with vulnerability. This is a 30-day journey that we're taking together, walking hand in hand with vulnerability, exploring its depths and insides and outs, so that we can leave and have a better understanding on what vulnerability means to us in our own lives. What makes vulnerability so interesting to me is it requires us to know that, one, we're exposed, or there is a sense of being present in the exposure. But 2, are we aware of it? Are we aware? Sometimes we can be vulnerable and be unaware. Think about that. So today we're going to be hitting a topic that this topic is so important that I felt that it's worth talking about for the next 3 days. So the topic that we're going to be diving right into is shame. Shame. Wow. Where does shame lie in this conversation with vulnerability? You know what makes it so interesting as it relates to the conversation that we've been having together is the more that we discover that there's vulnerable places in our lives, the more we'll start to identify those things that are in us. Shame is one of those things. When I was a child, I used to sit down and talk to my mom, and my mom would always say, babe, we need to have a working definition whenever we're having a conversation. Our working definition has to be about the topic we're discussing or whatever is important that we're trying to discover. So I'm going to take that same principle and apply it today. Today, we're going to have a working conversation, so it could be a universal approach for all of us to know exactly what we're talking about when we reference this shame. So shame is an unpleasant, self-conscious emotion, typically associated with a negative evaluation of the self. It's withdrawal of motivation and feelings of distress, mistrust, powerlessness, and worthlessness are added. So again, consider that working definition as we dive into shame. So close your eyes. Imagine a gardener. Can you see him? Can you see him walking his land and his soil? He's determining what seeds he wants to plant and where he wants to plant it. You see, the gardener is responsible for monitoring the health of the soil. Do you see him monitoring it? Can you watch him as he's walking up and down, looking at the dirt? A gardener is also responsible for feeding the soil seeds so that he can plant and receive later what he planted. So a seed is planted and eventually it'll grow. So the gardener understands this. So he's consciously aware of what's planted into the ground. At least he should be. The next responsibility of a gardener is to trim the edges of anything that grows that doesn't belong. May it be weeds or abnormalities, anything that he sees fit that doesn't belong. His responsibility is to trim the edges. He also needs to fertilize the land. He needs to add different components in the land to help support the seed's growth. Can you see this farmer out there farming the land? Can you visualize him? Well, I'm glad that you can, because we're going to use him in this conversation today. See, the conversation that we're going to discuss has to do, of course, with vulnerability. And when we look at that word vulnerability, we know it means to be exposed, but also we're using the idea that you're present in this exposure. Because for too long, we've been unconsciously aware of vulnerability. Now we're going to be aware of what's exposed in us. So who's that farmer you were visualizing? Who's the farmer or the gardener in your life? Who's responsible to come into your life and plant the seeds in you? Are you giving that responsibility to other people? Are you allowing them access to your land? Are you being vulnerable, allowing them to plant seeds in you without your permission? Who's the gardener in your life? You see, we ought to be our own gardeners. That's where this conversation is driving, because as we get enough information to connect to shame, we need to understand what's getting put into us and what's coming out of us. You see, the soil represents us. Biblically, the Bible states that God made us from the dust of the earth, the soil. We are represented by the soil. So things come in us and things come out of us. So we need to be aware of that. But now that we're talking about shame, let's talk about what happens and what does shame deposit in us. So when you hear that word shame, it can be synonymous with the words humiliation, mortification, embarrassment, discomfort, right? Once shame is present, shame should be a clear signal to you and I that our positive feelings have been interrupted. When shame is present, it's a clear signal to you and to us that our positive feelings have been interrupted. You see, we talked about the feelings that shame will plant in us. Shame will plant feelings of distress, which has to do with anxiety. Shame will plant feelings of mistrust. Ooh, do you recall the moments where you felt like you couldn't trust somebody because you were protecting something? Shame will make you withhold information. Shame will plant the seed of powerlessness, feeling like you don't have control over your situation, wondering why things are constantly happening to you and you just lack that control. Sometimes when you feel shame, you just feel that things are just happening to happen. What seed is inside of you? Who is the gardener? Shame will give you a feeling of worthlessness, as if you have no value. It'll snatch the value right up under you and replace it with a sense of you're not worth it. Shame. You see, shame does its job. It evaluates you and it tells you that you're negative. It tells your own self. Shame will tell you you're negative. So because we understand it's important for us to identify who the gardener is, and hopefully we all agree the gardener is us. We need to recognize that we have the ability to receive and to deny, right? So if we have received shame into our lives, we need to understand when these feelings are planted, the behaviors that can come from them can be tremendously impacting our lives negatively. You see, another thing that you have to consider is this. Another person or circumstance can trigger shame in us, but also so can failure to meet our own ideal standards. Again, another person or circumstance, it can trigger shame in us, but also our failure to meet our standards. You have a standard, you have values. So when you don't meet them, there's an immense or a certain feeling that comes with that. That's shame. Shame is also oftentimes confused with guilt, but we're not going to jump into that conversation today. That's going to be 3 days from now on Friday. Shame also can impact our children and even our childhood. Shame can impact our culture, and shame can definitely impact our community. You see, this shame is such an interesting thing that we need to be aware of. And why do we feel this sense of worthiness? Why do we feel this sense of not having power or control? Why do we feel this anxiety or this distress? Why do we feel that our motivation is taken away from us? I wanted to introduce you to shame. So just like the gardener, it's our responsibility to assess our land, ourselves. And if you have shame in your life right now, and you are the gardener, if you need the support from other people, you need to know to make sure that you're talking to gardeners that know what they're talking about. If you're religious, you know God is an awesome leader. God can help guide us and direct us in the ways and the truths within us. If you're an individual who has a mentor, talk to your mentor. Let them help you determine how to garden your land. But that's a trust thing, right? But more importantly, you have to put yourself in position to really learn who you are. Assess yourself, examine yourself, and trust me, it takes vulnerability. Thank you for listening in today. Day number 7 is done. Tomorrow, again, we're going to jump into that conversation and we're still going to introduce shame. But again, I want you guys to create clarity in your life. Because when you create clarity in your life, you can see clear. Be blessed and have a wonderful night.